Well, hello and welcome. I'm very excited that you're able to join us today for this panel conversation. We're going to be hearing from leaders in law enforcement about how community perspectives impact the delivery of local police services. My name is Matt Fulton, and I'm the Vice President for National Engagement for a company called Polco. Our company helps communities build stronger engagement and track performance, taking into account residents' perspectives on how communities perform in every aspect. Today, we have an excellent panel assembled to have a conversation around putting police needs and expectations into a community context. We're going to be talking about the challenges that law enforcement agencies and those responsible for keeping communities safe, how do they go about understanding and managing and responding to public safety needs that are in the community, especially from those that they serve, particularly in today's environment where communities nationally are just been so disrupted because of the pandemic and community unrest, all the economic uncertainties that people are working through, and of course then all the polarization that communities are struggling with. Our goal today really is just simply that you come away with a new idea, maybe a fresh perspective, or a new strategy, something that you can benefit from to move your communities forward in these challenging times. So here's the format for the discussion today. We'll take a few minutes to introduce each of the panelists and let them briefly talk about their backgrounds a little bit, and then I'll kick the conversation off and kind of set the stage and then ask a series of questions of each of our panelists that'll draw out their perspectives and their strategies and the way that they're dealing with this issue in their communities. Once the panelists respond to all the questions, we'll provide an opportunity for them to ask each other questions that may come up. And then if there's any questions from the outside, we'll certainly entertain them as well. So if that's okay, why don't we get going with some introductions. Our first panelist is Chief Kevin Sylvester, who's the chief of the Ossining Police Department in New York. Ossining is a community of about 25,000 on the beautiful Hudson River, just upriver from Manhattan. He's been in law enforcement for almost 20 years and was promoted to the chief of police at the ripe age of 35, making him the youngest police chief in New York at the time. What was really very interesting about Kevin is that he's also a practicing attorney and currently serves as an adjunct professor at Pace University. In 2018, he was named as a rising star by the Business Council of Westchester. And then it was followed up with a recognition as a 40 under 40 awardee by the International Association of the Chiefs of Police. Chief, I was really impressed with those recognitions and really appreciate you being here. And if you wouldn't mind, would you just share a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. I was really fortunate to step into the position that I got at the time that I did. And in large part, that was because of, my interest in community outreach, specifically with social media and community engagement. So glad to be here as part of this today. I'm a huge fan of social media. We love using that for communication with the community. And we're always looking for new ways to engage with our residents.
That's great. Thanks, Chief. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Assistant Chief of Police Richard Scott. Chief Scott has over 24 years of police experience, most of which has been in Texas. He has managed all aspects of this modern and progressive police department. And I have to say his academic credentials are also very impressive. Chief Scott's academic and leadership resume includes a master's degree in criminal justice from the University of Texas. And he's gone through the Senior Management Institute for Police, the ICP, a Leadership in Police Organizations program. And I'm always impressed by people that go through the FBI Academy. Chief Scott is currently serving in a variety of leadership roles, serving his community and profession. And one of the things, Rick, that really caught my attention was just your commitment around data-driven decision-making and recognizing the value of community and police collaborations and those kinds of things. And so I just wanted to make sure that I recognize you for that. But if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to hear a little bit more.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Matt. And I appreciate you having me and also putting this panel together. I think, now more than ever, it's important that we have these conversations, that we're having these conversations across leaders across the country, as well as with our communities. So thank you for taking the initiative and helping us come together and come up with some creative solutions. I think using data is, we've been doing that for many years in law enforcement, but it's only going to become more and more important in the future. And that I think your most successful police departments are going to find those ways to pull out that data and use that to support our community engagement efforts. So thanks again, Matt. Looking forward to the conversation.
That's great. Thanks, Rick. I appreciate those thoughts. I'm happy to introduce our third panelist, who is the Public Safety Director, Paul Hoppe, out of Wyoming, Minnesota. Paul and I are both Minnesota folks and enjoying the warmer weather relative to the rest of the country today. So we love being in Minnesota. Paul has more than 30 years experience in law enforcement and has been in his current position for over 10 years. Director Hoppe's also had a very impressive academic resume with a master's degree in police administration. He also has gone through the FBI National Academy. Chief Hoppe is also on the board of directors for the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association and teaches community outreach, social media, and communications for the State Leadership Academy. Paul, I just really want to thank you for being part of our conversation today and really are looking forward to your thoughts. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, like the other two chiefs said, I really appreciate being invited to participate in part of the panel today. I think community engagement, is more important than it ever has been in my 30 years in law enforcement. And certainly technology has offered us, new avenues to reach out to people. And when it comes to police reform, we're kind of the epicenter in Minnesota right now for it. And there's never been more important time than now. So appreciate participating and be invited to be part of this panel.
That's great. Thanks so much, Paul. So the topic that we're going to be exploring today is putting police needs and expectations into a community context. I was a city manager for over 30 years, and I have to say I've just got a great appreciation and respect for the work that you do and the challenges that you confront in all law enforcement agencies and personnel, and just simply meeting the public safety needs of the community. Public safety in any community is probably the most critical responsibility leaders have to confront, and it impacts every aspect of a community's overall success and their quality of life. Those that serve in law enforcement have such a frontline role in creating a sense of safety for residents, businesses, stakeholders, and just simply creating that atmosphere and that environment where people are going to feel comfortable being at any time or a day or night. Your leadership roles are not easy, I very well know. You have many who are placing very high expectations on your performance, and any type of failure can result in very significant community impacts that have generational kind of impacts. And so I really do value the role that you're doing. Here's maybe a high-level overview of some of the issues that we're hoping to explore today. As I mentioned, police departments are challenged with every day with overlapping, nonstop, and evolving situations that need to be handled professionally, respectfully, and responded to in an appropriate manner. You're consistently needing to adapt to changing community priorities and organizational demands, all that are being impacted by changing community demographics and economic conditions. And as you well know, a 24/7 news and social media cycle that may or may not provide an accurate reporting of what you're responding to or even how you're responding to it. And then you add on top of that a global pandemic and a very polarized political environment and higher unemployment and business disruptions, and just everything that has impacted people's lives on a day-to-day basis. It just creates a really a unique environment that are confronting not only law enforcement agencies, but communities in general. At the same time, 2020 has presented all sorts of impacts on you as leaders of your department from a staffing standpoint, just the organizational issues that you've needed to contend to. And so everything relating to this topic has been disrupted over the course of the last year. So how do you go about understanding the current needs of the community and being able to manage and meet those needs, all with the added expectations of being accountable, trustworthy, and providing equity for all? Just as a quick backdrop, let me just share some research from our National Police Services Survey, which was is a benchmark community survey. It's intended to provide communities an accurate and comprehensive picture of resident perspectives around local police services. We did 2 national panels, both randomly selected with 2,000 people participating in each, really to measure a shift in resident sentiment between 2018 and 2020. And the data that you see in front of you today talks about the national priorities that were identified through this panel exercise over the course of the last couple of years. While you can get an appreciation of the overall priorities that are identified, one of the things I wanted to point out to you, though, is the areas that actually increased in priority focused on those things that relate to building a police and community connectedness, on doing neighborhood problem solving, or things that just impact on the overall community. And I found that really very interesting, and I'll share this report with you following this panel conversation. But a lot of the conversation around today is going to be focused on how do you connect with your residents in a way that you can understand what the current needs are, how do you manage them, and how do you go about delivering and incorporating their perspectives on in the work that you're doing. So there are 3 questions that we want to go over today. Those questions are: what role should the community play in guiding or influencing the delivery of local police services? The second is, what strategies do you use for managing community expectations? And then the third one focuses in on what tools and methods do you use to understand resident expectations and priorities with the local police services. And in order to get going, what I'd like to do is start off with you, Chief Sylvester. And Chief Sylvester, what role should the community play in guiding or influencing the delivery of police services in Ossining?
The community is everything, right? I mean, without a community, it's not about what we want as law enforcement. It's what the community wants from us. I think one of the problems that we're seeing right now is that with all of the uncomfortableness, you hear from a lot of people in the community that have long historical bad feelings towards law enforcement, and you have cops that are feeling uncomfortable coming to work, feeling like they've gone from the good guys to the bad guys. The biggest struggle we're finding right now is that somebody's got to be first. And, what we encourage for our staff is that they've got to go out and they've got to build that bridge, because nobody's going to come to us. So I think that in terms of the community's responsibility is that they've got to be open to accepting that invitation. Our officers have to be willing to get out of the car, to walk around, to meet with people, to engage with them, to find out what it is they want and need, to find out what level of service our community is going to expect. And then we need our community to be able to be open and honest about what it is that they want from us. So, I think ultimately the issue is that, we hear too many times from too much of our staff that, we know what the community needs, or we know what the community wants. I think we have to be always willing to be listening to how that changes and how that adjusts year over year in terms of what the community expectation is. But somebody's got to be first, and it needs to be us.
Chief Sylvester, do you have, in your operations, do you have your community broken down into neighborhood grids where you assign officers, or how do you deal with making sure that you're getting to all corners of your community?
Like most other communities in the country, we're relatively small, 25,000 people and 6 square miles. So we break down into sectors, but our officers, we try to empower them to be as flexible as possible, whether that means backing up an officer in the neighboring sector or, moving around fairly freely in order to address problems as they come in. A big misperception in our neighborhoods is that community policing means that, simply that we're going out and smiling at people, when it's not. It's a problem-solving mechanism. So, the objective for us here is to break it down by sector so we can identify where those areas are. But in a small enough community like this, anything that affects somebody in one neighborhood is going to affect somebody in another. So, yeah.
And have you found during the past year, have you found the levels of engagement to be any different than it was historically?
We've had a really great run. Like I said, very, very fortunate to come into this position at a very young age, at a relatively peaceful time. I have enjoyed a really nice time as chief of police. This year has been challenging. We are a majority minority community. We're more than 60% Hispanic and Latino in our school district here. So, when people see things on TV, it's very, very emotional things when they're watching what's going on in other parts of the country. Our big pitch for our community is to stay focused on what we have going on here. We'll identify and execute on the problems that we have within our police department, but I can't necessarily impact what goes on in other parts of the country. So, for the way we're dealing with our community, we've had certainly a breakdown communication at the beginning. We've slowly built that up over time, be it through state mandated reform processes. COVID-19 has really put a wrench in our style because, some of the things that we enjoy most are we throw block parties and we do the coffee with the cop programs and the getting outside, cops and kids sports and all those things that we're known for, but that really gives police officers joy in coming to work has really been taken away from us, that ability to connect with people on those really positive moments. So we've really got to focus on addressing some of the more uncomfortable stuff. And certainly for several months, people were a bit standoffish. I think we're seeing a little bit of that being broken down now, but every day is a task.
Yeah, thank you. Chief Scott, what role should the community play in guiding or influencing the delivery of local police services?
Well, thank you, Matt. And I think, Chief Sylvester hit the nail on the head, and the community, should tell us the type of law enforcement that they want for their community. At the end of the day, and we preach here at North Richland Hills, it's all about partnership. And we are in partnership with our community to make our community as a whole much safer. And the only way we can do that is to have that partnership. It's not something that law enforcement can come in and do for the community. It's something they can accomplish with the community. I think one of the things that's been incredibly valuable here at North Richland Hills is I like to say that we breed a culture of community engagement. And this isn't something that comes from the top of our organization that, we tell officers you must, have X amount of community contacts or whatever that may be. But really, it's a culture of engagement from the bottom up, where officers are empowered to be problem solvers. They're looking for ways to engage the community where the community is. The community is not going to come to you and bring you all of their problems and solutions. We have to go meet the community where the community is. As Kevin mentioned, you find opportunities to go to the ball games. You find opportunities to stop and get out of that patrol car and have a conversation with a citizen who's not in trouble. Just a random conversation can do so much for your organization. We are committing, to being accessible. We have to find new ways, I think, to be accessible and to listen to what our community is telling us they would like from their police department. The other side of the equation is if you're going to take the time to listen, then you must take the time to respond and show results. And sometimes we can't do all the things that the community wishes we could do. That's okay. Be transparent and, work with them on why we weren't able to achieve certain objectives. And then we'll come back at it and maybe do a better job next time. But I believe just having that transparency, that communication can really start the effort of forging those relationships, which is really what community policing is built upon. We've seen over this, the past couple of decades where law enforcement legitimacy, trust and legitimacy has really been put to the test and challenged. And I think some of the failures we've seen across the country really came out of a lack of trust or legitimacy, for their local law enforcement. And so getting back to those principles, looking for those opportunities to build up trust and legitimacy every contact at a time, really is the underpinnings of what I believe is a successful community policing or community partnership strategy with our community.
Chief Scott, have you done anything unique in working with your business community in North Richland?
We have we see our business community as just one other part of our larger community. So we do take time to get out and visit with our businesses to understand what challenges that they face and how we can better police, their communities. Because if you don't have a safe environment, you can't keep businesses in your community. If you don't have good businesses, you can't keep citizens in your community. So it really all kind of works together. One of the things that we've done, we have a large Hispanic population in North Richland Hills, and we didn't come up with this. We kind of imported it from some of our neighbors, but it's called Unidos, and it means united. And so we have opportunities to engage our Hispanic community in Unidos activities. One of the things I'm most proud of is we actually have a health or community fair where we invite different segments, different businesses from all across the community to come together, provide either free or affordable resources to those in our community who may not be able to otherwise afford them. And so from our perspective, if you're meeting those baseline needs, then we're able to have those conversations about community and safety, because if they're hungry, if they're sick, that's really what's important to them. And so you start meeting some of those basic needs to where you can, again, come back to that trust and legitimacy.
Yeah, I love that unitos idea. That's a great concept. Chief Hoppe, what role should the community play in guiding and influencing the delivery of police services in Wyoming?
Matt, I certainly think that, the community has a significant role in really defining what those services are. As police organization, as leaders, we're always looking for opportunities, to really customize sometimes our services that are specific to our community. And what's important, to the people in any community is really about safety, security, and quality of life. And our services are driven to really support that quality of life within a community. And how is it that we define quality of life if we don't have community input? I mean, the community certainly defines what those quality of life issues are specific to an individual community, on top of the bigger issues of security and safety and everything else. And if we're not engaging those community members and we're not involving them in determining what our quality of life issues are specific to our community, then we're simply not focused on what best serves our community. So I think it's extremely important to do that. In 30 years that I've been doing it, I've been around when the Rodney King issues happened and been, around when, Ferguson happened. And certainly being only 20 miles from Minneapolis, we've seen some issues here as well, over the last couple of years. And what we've done in Wyoming is we started back in about 2014 or 15, really trying to change the narrative of our organization with the intent of building what we call community capital. And we did that. We're probably one of the first organizations that changed how we communicate on social media, or really turned up, our activity on social media. And our goal was to take what most people community see as institutions and break those barriers down and really humanize the law enforcement officer. And when we did that, we did a paradigm shift from being recognized as more of a warrior style enforcement, institution, to more of a community engaged guardianship style of policing. And when we effectively did that, what we saw was a lot more community engagement from just our regular residents, that on a daily basis, instead of us approaching them, they were actually approaching our officers out on the street, starting up just casual conversations with them, and really deinstitutionalize and humanize the law enforcement officer, which then transcends over into a significant increase in community engagement. We do the large events, we do the park events, the National Night Out, the DARE programs inside the schools and the business engagement. But when we can expand that beyond special events and actually have one-on-one conversations with our community, uninitiated by us, but by them, we get a lot more authentic information from our community that then leads back to our leadership, which then helps to redefine what our service levels are to ensure that we're focused on those quality of life issues within that community.
That's really well said. Because you have been in the midst of the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan region, and I'm sure that your officers have been involved in some aspects with everything that's going on in the region. I mean, how are your officers doing, and how are you dealing with some of the needs that your officers have with just kind of with the overall community pressures that are placed on them?
Yeah, we're not immune to what's happening just 20 miles south, of where we reside. And there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, amongst our staff as we're seeing significant police reforms come out from a state level to a national level. There's a lot of uncertainty within our staff of what the future of law enforcement looks like, what protections that the officers have, from a personal or professional basis. And so it creates some uncertainty within just our staff and reluctanceness with them as well as we kind of have to redefine, what those police services look like, what some of our requirements are and obligations and responsibility as police administrators are. And we redefine on how much input, that community does have, whether it be on something that we send out on survey level, or what we engaged on community policing, or some of what the impacts are going to be from those civil unrest events that happen, that certainly get the attention of our elected officials all the way up to the state and national level, and are implementing new reform and changes within our industry that are having significant impacts on our staff.
I really respect what all of you have said about one of the things I was always the most impressed with when I was a city manager was just the way that you were able to make those connections and build those relationships really at the street level and in the neighborhoods, and all of those personal connections. And all of you are talking about the importance of the humanization of a police officer and building those relationships in a positive way so that people want to be part of the community and part of that positive engagement aspect. And so that's just really solid. Thank you. Let's move on to the second question. And Chief Scott, I'd like to start with you. What strategies do you use for managing community expectations in North Richland Hills?
Yeah, and I commend Paul for his comment on the warrior versus guardian mindset, and actually that's kind of one of the base strategies that we use here, and that's been a shift that's been occurring over the years. Again, we see it here, we see it nationally, where more and more, and this is coming from troop level, where our officers are shifting that mindset from a guardian mindset or mentality, or from a warrior mentality over to a guardian mentality. And really that kind of centers on caretaking, where they have ownership of their communities, the neighborhoods that they serve, and they're seeking to be a caretaker of that area and the citizens that live there, rather than a warrior who's just policing. And so it's really, policing 2.0, where they're looking past the problems, working for innovative solutions, again, with our community. I think another strategy is to check your culture early and often. A department's culture is something that's very fluid, and we as leaders like to think that we can always guide that, but we need to be very attentive and stay focused on the department's culture to make sure that it is the direction that we want it to be in, and that it's actually serving our community the way it's intended to. One of the things that I think are beneficial, or that we've used here, is a no harm approach to policing. And really what that means is that, our approaches are not outweighing our objectives, where we're looking for, peaceful ways to police our communities and solve problems, but that we're not, our strategies aren't creating more harm than the good that we're trying to serve by serving our communities. And so I think that has a lot of value when you sit down and talk to our residents about the types of laws that we're enforcing and how we're enforcing them and why. I think you can provide some clarity on those issues that we're working to solve as a police department. Aside from that, you can look at a lot of the complaints that your department's receiving. That can be a barometer for the type of activity that our officers may be engaged in. And again, it comes back to that culture. Are they, are we following policy? Are there areas where, we can tune up our policies, or where our policies may not be performing correctly? So early warning systems, things like that, can be of value. Looking at those complaints, doing annual reports to make sure that we're not leaning one direction or another, and that when problems do pop up, that we're very efficient at dealing with those, so we don't see a reoccurrence. Lastly, I think engaging our community from an advisory standpoint. This can be met across the country with different opinions, but I believe if you invite the community into your police department and provide a role for them to have consistent input, to look at those policies, to look at the training practices that we're rolling out, and what the results of those activities are, I think it's a great opportunity to get buy-in and give the community a firsthand look at actually what we're doing, and then to listen to the input that we're hearing from them about how we can adjust some of our practices to better meet their needs. Again, hear me, this is more of a training advisory board, not necessarily an oversight committee. That works in some areas, and some areas may need that, but I think there should be some community engagement into, again, the training and policies of the department, where it's applicable to your own personal department.
Chief, are you, you're in a progressive environment, and clearly you're advising that the early warning systems is really being proactive and trying to get ahead of the issue before it becomes an issue. But for communities that are trying to figure out the best way to approach it, the benefits of being proactive versus reactive. What do you find in your department that you would suggest to other departments that would like to get a little bit more of an early warning system in place, and what would they see as a value of that?
Yeah, correct, Matt. And that's the great statement, be proactive than reactive. And, if you're trying to implement, even build relationships or implement policies in a crisis, those don't usually work very well because you're being reactive to the situation. To be proactive is to take advantage of, some calmer waters to implement some of these policies that can protect us in the future when we know it is going to get rough. And so any policy is, I think, with meeting with the officers and seeing what their needs are, meet with your associations, meet with your union leaders, and find out, okay, this is the direction we'd like to go. What traction are we going to get from them, and how can we come together for a mutually beneficial solution? A lot of our officers didn't understand what an early warning system was, and from some of the stories out there, we're quite intimidated by what this technology could mean for them. But I think if you're transparent and you explain what the system is, that you work with them on setting parameters and you work with them on giving them the data. This isn't something the department has to hold on to, that we can share that data with our officers and help them look for those areas where we can improve. And maybe, again, look at ourselves at some of the areas with policies and practice that we should improve. So I think if done right, an early warning system can be a great tool for both our officers and the administration, as well as the community. I think they will see great value that we're looking at those things and that we're being responsive. But really just being transparent and being very vocal about how we're going into those processes where we're engaging all the stakeholders.
Yeah, thank you for that. The other thing I heard you talk about, which I think is sometimes is underappreciated, and that's the value of collaborating internally with your staff about how it is you're going to be able to be proactively accomplishing your mission and setting that culture like you're talking about. Those are all just really excellent. Thank you. Chief Hoppe, what strategies do you use for managing community expectations in Wyoming?
Yeah, I certainly think Chief Scott, building off of what he talked about, relative to, checking your barometer, your organizational barometer, I think is extremely important. You want to be able to, to pair up what your culture is, certainly with your community, so that you're working collaboratively together to solve problems, the early intervention rather than the catastrophic issues. And that truly is a collaborating culture that exists with not only the police department and your staff, but as a community as a whole, knowing that that they have access to the organization, that their feedback is appreciated and listened and heard. But going even farther than that, it really starts with a core value system. And we all have mission and vision statements that we have for our organizations. And here in Wyoming, they're not just words. Their core value systems is what drives not our belief system, but also it drives our actions. And when you take it from a word statement to an action plan in your core values, and you hold yourself accountable to them first and foremost before the community holds you accountable to them, that's where you really start to build that trust and transparency within the organization. And the trust is the results of great transparency driven from core value systems that you believe in and that you exercise and that you practice as an organization. So I think those are, some really important elements that are at the core of what we do as organizations to really look at how we engage and how we take feedback and be critical of ourselves first and foremost, and do it at an early stage so that we don't have to wait for the community to be critical for us. What I try to teach my staff is when it comes to organizational change and culture change, if we're proactive about it, we get to influence the change. We have a say in how it's crafted or changed or how we build for and hire for the future. But if we're reactive to it, we're certainly going to be a victim of the change. We're probably not going to have a lot of input in how the outcome looks. It's going to be imposed on us rather than influenced from inside the organization. And it's certainly a much better place to be in the proactive upfront side, where you influence your change rather than on the reactive side where it's imposed upon you. The outcomes usually aren't that great for the organization. And sometimes even the solutions don't work for what your long-term objectives are for serving a community. So I think that's really important. And that's part of the culture build that we look at from not only where we are today in the barometer check, but also on how we hire and how we train to continue to improve the culture going forward and building the organization for the future.
That's very well stated. You know, Chief Scott was talking about the collaborative nature of working internally with the officers on kind of helping to set that culture, find those successes, setting the tone. The question I have for you, Chief Hoppe, in Wyoming, because public safety is an organizational mission, and as you start thinking about how do you integrate the culture, not only in the department, but in the other departments of the community, anything you can suggest or add of how you deal with managing resident expectations in a meaningful way beyond just the police borders and other departments in the community?
Yeah, you know, certainly in a public safety model, I do oversee the fire, the police department, emergency management. And so really a global approach. You know, we're not looking at it just from how the police department serves the community, but how does the city as a whole? So when we look at our priority, we have the priority cone, you know, where the community is the most important thing. That we drive of our mission is driven to serve in the community. Secondly is, you know, how do we fit within the organization as a whole, meaning the government entity that serves the community? How does our department how is our department affected, you know, by those global missions or services? And lastly, how does the employee fit within providing those services? I think, you know, some of the problems that organizations have had in the past and can be problematic is when we put the employee or the organization first as our priority, and the community falls something below that. And so for us, I'm really intentful about working with our staff, collaborating with our community. And I believe our community, one of the benefits that we have is we have enormous community support in Wyoming. And I think we demonstrate that, you know, not only in our online presence, but we have that because our priority is always the community. Our priority is how do we best serve that community, not just as an individual partner, you know, but as a global perspective of government on how we serve it, understanding that, you know, without the community and without their participation, we simply don't have a community. And so that's where, you know, we've focused on it relative to what our priorities are, and always serving, you know, the greater entity, which is the residents, the businesses, and the community as a whole. And that becomes our priority in everything that we do.
That's a great perspective. You know, I have found residents like to be engaged when they're part of a winning team. And so as you start thinking about community support that you're seeing, it's really probably a result of all of those things that you and others are building in Wyoming to make that happen, right? So you are part of building that winning team, and that was excellent. Thank you. Chief Sylvester, what strategies do you use for managing community expectations in Ossining?
Matt, I'm going to hop right off what you said right there. So everybody wants to be part of a winning team, and I think that one of the things that holds us back oftentimes in law enforcement, that relates to employees too. So when we're managing community expectations, I think one of the things we see way too often is departments that want to bat 1,000 all the time. We only want to talk about the things that we do well. We only want to talk about things when we know that the reaction is going to be a positive one. We only want to tell a story when we know it's a win for us. You know, one of the things that I advocate for all the time is giving as much information to the public as possible, because if we're telling you everything and we strike out once in a while, or we do something that could have been better, or there's a place where we can improve, the community can at least see the whole picture and understand what we are from that global perspective. You know, we really want them to see the whole picture. So part of our strategy for managing community expectations is giving people the reality of what goes on here. And, you know, one of the things that was told to me when I started this job was, I grew up in this community. I've been here my whole life. My father worked for the water department here, but people said to me, boy, if you knew everything that really went on here, you'd be shocked. And I thought that was a crazy statement until I worked here. And then I found out what really goes on in the community, a lot of things that happen behind closed doors that you don't know, you know, all of the best and worst moments of people's lives. You see a small snippet of it when you're in the community. And, you know, our job is to make sure that our residents here are well informed about what's going on, to the extent that they should know, while protecting people's privacy. We try to give them difficult messages in an easily digestible format, is the way we describe it. But I think that our responsibility is to provide as much information as possible so that people really do know everything that goes on. And I think that if we let our guard down a little bit, Chief Hoppe talked a little bit about humanizing, and I think that's a big part of it. His department was a big inspiration for us when we started on Twitter. And, you know, really how they interact with other agencies around them. But I think that if we can let our guard down, admit to people that we don't bat 1,000 every time, but that we give it our all every time we step to the plate, I think that's a huge deal. Second to that, and just to follow off what these folks were saying before, is that, you know, when we're looking at, Chief Hoppe had mentioned before about the events not being they really aren't the hallmark of policing. Things like block parties and National Night Out and Coffee with a Cop and being in the schools, those individual events are really not what it's about. Those are highlights of the everyday good work that goes into connecting with your residents, the cops that are out on foot that are engaging with our community. So, you know, some of the things that I see in policing right now, our municipality's gone through a survey recently as part of the reform process. And I really think that people sometimes fail to see that there really only are two outcomes that come from most surveys. Either you're going to find that there's an operational gap. In other words, that people want something done and you're not doing it. So there's an operational gap and identify somewhere that you can improve. Or people are asking for a service that you're actually doing, you failed to communicate. So I think that if people would be willing to accept feedback in surveys in that format, it's just there is no, we look at surveys of policing to say, here's the community pointing out all your weak points. And that's not necessarily what it is. The weak point may not be operational. It may simply be an issue of communication. So when we're managing expectations for folks in our community, we really need to make sure that it's not just about, I love the humanizing thing. I have made my career on humanizing our staff, but at the same time, it can't be everything, right? Humanizing gives us the privilege of being able to talk to you about the bad moments when they happen. So, you know, I like to take the feedback as it comes in, use the good credit we've earned through humanizing, and then be able to apply that in the difficult scenarios. And, you know, hopefully if you do all that perfectly, and you'll have that community expectation set.
That's just so well stated. You know, you're in such an urban environment. How do you go about managing expectations, working with your colleagues from kind of surrounding jurisdictions? You have a system that works well for you, or is it just that, I mean, how do you go about balancing the management of resident expectations?
Policing in America is a really interesting story in a sense that most good things start on the West Coast and work their way this way, which is why I learned from agencies in Texas and Minnesota. In New York, we really, other than say NYPD, which is a beast of its own nature, everyone else is really very much behind on department communications. There is not a huge presence on social media for most East Coast departments. So, you know, we've tried to use that as our way to connect with more people. Again, social media is not the answer. For a long time, the highlight of policing was the foot post. Everybody's going to get out of the car and talk to everybody. And then we found that by walking, we don't connect with every resident. So then we all focused on social media and we said, well, we'll talk digitally to everybody. Then we found out that we're missing a lot of people. There is no silver bullet that's going to solve all this. So we do both. Our point of pride this year is we've started an all Spanish language Facebook page. We found that our biggest, we have a very, very large predominantly Spanish-speaking population within our community, and we found that a lot of them were missing, not just missing the message, but missing the nuance of the message. And, you know, a translator app is nice for getting the substance of the message, but it really misses the emotion. So we have a detective and his band of cronies here who have started their own separate, distinct Facebook page for our department. That's where the community exists. In some places it's Twitter and others it's Instagram. For us, it's mostly parents in the school district that are getting the messages. And we manage a fully Spanish language, completely independent Facebook page in order to talk with people. And that's a good example of how, you know, in our area, we're trying to do something a little bit different in order to address some of those gaps.
That is very cool. You know, one of the things I'm hearing from you, Chief, is just the way that you're evolving and you're adapting and you're building into the changes that are going on in the communities all of the time. And I think that's just a very well stated example of how you're being creative and meeting the needs, especially for underrepresented segments of your community. So thank you. Chief Hoppe, what tools and methods do you use to understand resident expectations and priorities regarding local police services in Wyoming?
Well, yeah, and I'm going to kind of just segue off of what Chief Sylvester said, because he made some really good points. And number one being that, you know, policing in America is fluid. What has worked in the past isn't necessarily going to work in the future, and what works now isn't going to be sustainable going forward. So we have to be fluid and we have to be willing, to change and adapt to our communities as they grow, as their demographics change. And so I think that's, really important, to recognize as leaders. But I also want to touch on, the fact what he said is, all of our organizations want to celebrate that home run. And, we all strive, to bat 1,000. And the reality is it's just an unrealistic expectation that's going to happen, that we're going to accomplish that. One of the strategies that we do is we talk about community capital and building that community capital so that in the event that something negative happens or when it happens, and we've certainly had our challenges here, with use of force issues, with officer involved shootings, and we haven't been immune to that as an organization. But if we do the work up front and we build those connections and we involve the community and we allow them to collaborate and participate, and we build that community capital, when those catastrophic events happen, the community will be there to support you. They'll let you draw on that bank of capital that you've built prior to the event, and they'll help carry you through those challenging times. What the community won't do is they won't borrow you capital. If you haven't invested in it in the community, and you haven't invested and done that work before the event, they're not going to borrow and carry you through that catastrophic or that negative contact or that negative persona, only to allow you to pay them back. It's simply not how it works. And part of building that community capital, and Chief Sylvester is right. One of the strategies that I have used is to celebrate the positive. But I've also known for in Minnesota is also working with the media in collaboration as a partner rather than an adversary. And I do all of the tough interviews. That I do the interviews and talk about the use of force issues when they're not positive. That I will engage with them and do stories with them on the pursuit issues. And I think part of that transparency and building that capital is that you can't just celebrate the positive, but being transparent and having ownership and taking ownership of your organizational mistakes along the way is probably even more important. And being compassionate about that, and understanding that, this is going to be a challenging time for us as an organization, as a community, but together we work through it. And standing in front of that community as your community leader, and explaining, what went wrong, what's going to, the change is going to be coming out of it, and how we're going to improve and better the community, the organization as a whole going forward, I think is exceptionally important. Probably more important when it comes to building community capital than celebrating just positives.
That's very well stated. I love the phrase you're using about you can't borrow community capital. That is so true. So the proactive theme that we're talking about today is resonating there very clearly. Can you share a little bit with some of the tools that you're using to get resident input on how you're doing?
We're probably known nationally for our social media, Twitter or Facebook, and how we engage with them. When we first launched that in 14 or 15, people weren't doing it the way that we decided to do it. And I think when we talk about, policing in America and the fluidness of it, there were significant risks that we took. There were calculated risks because we changed the narrative on how we communicate. And that's probably been our greatest benefit. That we created not just a platform where we could push institutionalized information out, but we actually used our social media platforms to create blogs, that we unlocked them and we gave our public the opportunity to freely comment on it. I mean, obviously we have some restrictions on harassment and profanities and stuff, but for the most part, we opened it up and we allowed our positive supporters to comment on there, but we also allowed our negative supporters to comment on there as well, and we didn't censor them. And I think that was extremely, extremely important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it showed that as an organization, we're open to criticism. Because without that criticism, it's difficult to change. And secondly, what we saw was our positive supporters truly outweighed our negative supporters. And our staff would see that as well, as the positive supporters would actually defend us on those platforms. And so it served a couple of different ways. But when we want real feedback, relative to critical issues or policy changes, we've used your vocal surveys in the past. As we launched our body camera software, and in Minnesota, that has to go out for public comment and public feedback before we can finalize our policies. And that was a great tool. We were able to gather some real content, some real data on shaping our policies, and communicating with our public what the expectations were going to be from a law enforcement perspective, but also what they could expect when they saw the body cameras on the officers as they entered the privacy of their homes, and how that data was going to be used. So, we used to do town hall meetings. That's what it used to be. And as our society has changed and come more digital, we simply just don't see the participation on that front. And so the access to people through a digital platform no longer requires them to come to us, rather we go to them. And one of the other chiefs talked about that earlier, relative, we're going to where the people are. And with all the technology and phones and everything else, we can literally get into their pocket all day long and engage with them in the convenience of their couch and a time frame that best works for them. And that's probably been the biggest change that I've seen in probably the last 20 years relative to community engagement, is the ease of access, and at a cost that's almost non-existent because of the free platforms that are out there.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I'm glad the platform is working for you with some of the issues that you're dealing with. Chief Sylvester, what tools and methods do you use to understand resident expectations and priorities regarding police services and Ossining?
Yeah, we're heavily social media based. So a lot the way Wyoming does with, it's a big deal to open up your page and subject yourself to open and honest feedback, sometimes too honest. There's a real learning curve for when law enforcement or any government agency jumps into social media, and how to tolerate, how to address, how to deal with all of the feedback that you get, because it gives people the opportunity to give instant feedback from wherever they are. As much as that's a good thing, it can be a challenging thing as well. People often type before they think, and that it can be hurtful. We have a lot of staff that really struggles with the things that can be written from time to time. But if Chief Hoppe pointed out anything right there, it was that if you do it right, you'll have your supporters backing you up, and you won't even need to do it yourself. And really, that's one of the things we're most proud of, is that we've gotten to a point where when someone complains, typically another resident will jump in and say, that's not the way things really work around here, or that's not what really happened, or that's not who they really are. So we do rely heavily on social media, but like I said before, we try to tie that. We try to use our digital connections to facilitate real-time interactions. So without COVID, we would be spending as much time as possible throwing community events. We partner with our school district and local health clinics and cultural associations and all those type of groups. This has really, really been a challenging year for us, because I think that what really makes a police department is not so much it's as much the events that you're putting on for the community as the feeling that the officers get from attending and putting on those events. So at the end of any good community outreach event, we've got a staff full of people going, this is why I come here. This is why I keep coming back. The paycheck's nice, but this is why I keep coming back. And, with that missing, it's really, really been tough, because we don't have that reminder of the most meaningful moments that we have in policing. So, we try to do a lot of digital work. We try to tie that to our real life interactions, and hopefully with a combination of the two, we find some truth in between.
The interesting thing you said earlier about people that maybe are more negative about police operations, it's really a matter of how well you've communicated to them. And so as you kind of think about your use of social media and people, your community that actually is kind of supporting those critical comments, that really does become an indirect communication tool for you. So that whole issue about building a positive community culture and those types of things becomes really important. Anything you want to add about the value of that?
Yeah, I think that where a lot of departments, at least in their initial phase of getting into digital communications, whether it be social media or some other platform they're using, are typically using it as what some of our friends at other organizations would call a digital bullhorn, where we're speaking and we're just yelling at the community from a digital platform, and they're not really using it for the purpose of getting feedback. It is an extremely difficult challenge to answer all of your comments, particularly when you're doing this on a 24-hour cycle, and I don't have a very large staff. my children have grown to expect that my phone will be in my hands 24 hours a day at this point. But the reality is that answering as many of those comments as possible is really the magic of social media. That's your opportunity to interact with every single resident you have in some way, shape, or form. You're never going to please everyone. We've learned that now. We're probably not even going to please a lot of people, but we're going to get to as many as we can with as much truth as we can. And, when we talk about, our duty here, really what we're doing is managing expectations. We have to give people reality, not just the happiness. So I think that using social media as a two-way or whatever mechanism you're using it is making sure that it's two-way is the most important. If you're out on patrol and you're just talking to people and not listening, you're not doing your job.
That's very valuable insight. One of the things that we've learned is if you take a look at the past 12 months, about 50% of the population hasn't even had interactions with a police officer. So their perspectives are really shaped by what they are reading in social media, on the media accounts. And a lot of the experiences that people have had with law enforcement has actually been very, very positive. One of the things we've learned is that during COVID, trust in local government has actually gone up, and it's probably in large part based on the work that law enforcement officers are doing in the streets and on the front row. Just because there is that need to have more direct interaction on just helping people survive during this pandemic and all of the other things they're trying to balance between finding a job and homeschooling their kids. And I will contend that the folks who are on the front line, like law enforcement and other municipal employees that are just helping people to survive, have helped to kind of turn that trend up in terms of trust in local government. So thank you. Those are just great perspectives. Chief Scott, what tools and methods do you use to understand resident expectations and priorities regarding police services in North Richland Hills? Thank you.
Thank you. And just to open the question, I'll say both my colleagues are highly locked on this and have realized that social media, I think by far has been one of the best tools available to us. Much like Chief Hoppe, our community, we have a wonderful community and they've supported us through thick and thin. And I can't imagine a better place to work because of our community and the way they support their police department. But one of the tools that we've implemented is, social media. And what it does, we're in an information now age where people expect to have an update or a briefing or be able to engage the department in a conversation 24 hours a day and have an immediate response. While that may not be entirely possible, we do our best to make that happen. And when we do receive feedback or commentary, we do respond. We let them know that they're being heard and that we're listening. And again, while we can't do everything, we are transparent in the things that we can do. Much like it was mentioned, we don't censor, we don't cull through any of our posts, and anybody's free to post anything they want about the North Richland Hills Police Department. But again, we have that strong community support, and if it's not true, our community will definitely come to our defense to set the record straight, essentially. I think really just seeking out those hard conversations, having difficult conversations. And we want our staff to be out there engaging our community, again, where the community is, to have those difficult conversations about the things that are going on in the world today. Again, this year has been incredibly difficult, but our officers, I think they're some of the best in the country, and they're, I think, the best equipped to have that conversation with the community, with those citizens in the communities that they serve. I think, if you're having coffee with a cop, if you're having community meetings, great. Keep doing those. Those are good starters, but it goes beyond that. And we want to see our officers out in the community with the windows down, out of the car where those opportunities exist, again, to show that they're part of the community. I think one of the events that we're real proud of doing, it's called Fix It Blitz, where we go out and we adopt houses and citizens in our community, and we do repairs around their house or whatever it may be, painting a fence, doing yard work to show them that we're there to help them. And I always ask officers, because we have a flood of people that want to do this. And when they're done, I said, why did you come out on a Sunday on your day off to mow someone's grass? And they said, honestly, it really made me feel good. I liked helping the person because they needed the help, but it made me feel good too. And I think as law enforcement leaders, we have to be consistent about finding those opportunities to show our employees the value of the work that they do and cater to the things that got them in law enforcement to begin with. They became officers to help people. Sometimes that message can get lost, especially with all the noise out there in the media. It's good to remind them that we still do good work and that they're able to touch our community, one call at a time to help them where they need the help. I think, again, to talk about, I think Chief Hoppe had mentioned this about humanizing the work that we do. And social media has been incredibly valuable at showing the other side to law enforcement officers, that there's more than just a badge and a uniform to our police officers, that they're actually people, that they have families, and that they're human. And I think if the community connects with that and they understand that, they're a lot more adept to give you grace when you do make mistakes, as we know we will. They're a lot maybe slower to judge and will wait for the facts if they understand that you're actually a person and not just this badge and uniform. So again, not to overstate social media, but I think it's been one of the greatest phenomena that has helped us connect with our community, again, where they're at, in their pocket, on their phone. They're able to have a conversation with us anytime. And I think there's incredible value in that.
That's just outstanding. Thank you for that. Do you have any tips for local agencies for how frequently you post on social media? Anything that you have found as a practice that works?
Yes, I think if you're struggling with an issue, you can't communicate enough. Post as quickly as possible. Again, you want to be factual, but I think people understand that, especially at a large scale event, facts could actually change as the events develop. We tend to want to be as accurate as possible, and sometimes that can slow down our response as it should. But if you have the ability to communicate quickly and just put out some basic facts, I think that's always best, with the understanding that I'm going to follow up and continue to follow up until you have all the information that I can provide you as accurately as possible. So managing the amount of posts, I think, is important. We have an excellent social media coordinator here who helps us with all those issues. And she is fantastic about scheduling content, which I didn't understand that until I talked to her about scheduling stories and scheduling content to keep our community engaged. Don't hit them with everything at once, and then don't go dark either. So make sure that we're scheduling content in a reasonable and predictable fashion, that we're getting the information out there. So keep that community engaged, and also listen to what they're telling you, because they'll tell you on the kind of content that they want to hear. And conversely, they're pretty vocal about the things that they don't want to hear as well.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that. Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your perspectives. I'd like to just open up the table, though, today and just see if you have any questions you'd like to ask of each other. And you can just go ahead and jump in if you have something you want to talk to. If not, I do have one final question that I would like to just get each of your perspectives on, and that is, as you're looking at your departments right now, what would you say is the biggest challenge you're currently confronting right now as you're kind of looking forward? Chief Hoppe, why don't we start with you?
I would say that, certainly there's we're facing, because of our proximity to the metro and some of the trials that are going to be happening here with the Minneapolis officers, the 4 Minneapolis officers, over the next month or month and a half. That's certainly going to have a significant impact on our staff, as law enforcement officers, as they watch all of that transpire. But we're also anticipating that we're going to see some community issues. That regardless of what the outcome is, that not everybody's probably going to agree with them. And how do we stand up to, support our community, but yet, have to defend the community, and it may not be ours. It may be an neighboring agency. It may, our staff may have to be down in Minneapolis and supporting them as they go through that. And how does that perspective impact our community, as we have to invest and put our staff at risk, to work through some of those issues that, are certainly far more political than we are. But how those outcomes are going to impact us locally and nationally. I think I think there's a narrative that's in a national stage that's going to affect all of us, whether it be in New York or Texas or Minnesota, that we're going to see over the next couple of months as Minneapolis goes through these issues, and as Minnesota is kind of highlighted in this, and how we all have to work together. So I certainly think that, and as we talk about the online presence and the different narratives and the different stories, and what's accurate and what's not accurate, and how does that affect us as a profession, how does that affect our reputations and our perspectives from our communities, and the work that we have to do locally in your own communities to make sure that those narratives are correct. And the best way to do that is to demonstrate it, is to do the work that we've done in the past. And 2020 has certainly added some significant challenges to us engaging with our community. And we're excited and looking forward to what 2021 brings, and hopefully that we can get back to some of those traditional activities and connect with our residents, in person, and, not, just, because that's traditionally what we do, but just from a mental health perspective, and stabilizing the mental health of our community as a whole, and individuals, from the lack of contact and the lack of engagement. I think it's really important in 2021 that we reestablish that, and we don't rely on just the digital platform. And I'm a big digital platform guy, as probably most of these guys know, but I think we can't just do it without that personal contact piece. So I think for us in Minnesota, that we're anxious to see what's going to happen over the next 2 months as we kind of go through these trials and see what those outcomes are going to be, and how we manage that unrest, because it certainly will have an impact nationally, not just locally. And I think what we do and how we handle that in Minnesota is going to be on the front national and global stage. And so we're strategizing on what's really the best approach, and how do we serve our communities, and be cognitive of what that outcome is going to be, and compassionate about people and their feelings and their opinions and their desires as a community, and what they want to see out of law enforcement moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Chief. Chief Sylvester, what is the biggest challenge facing you right now?
I think rebuilding morale. It sounds a lot like we're only concerned for the police officers, but it's not altogether about them. It's what they mean to the community. So I think that, over the course of the past year, between COVID and feeling like they've put themselves out there at risk at times when people were holed up in their homes, nice and safe and warm, or it's the going through the protests and everything else, and feeling like they're being blamed for things they didn't do because it happened in another place. They've really built a thick skin over the course of a year, and I think it's going to take a rebirth. They're going to have to shed that skin and go back to being who they are. And I think that we're successful because we're willing to be vulnerable, and we show people who we are as human beings and police officers and parts of the community. We're people with children in the school district here, and coaches of little league teams, and we do all those things. And in order to go back to being a part of the community, we've really got to become a part of the community, which means we're going to have to shed that hard outer layer, and we're going to have to be able to make ourselves vulnerable again. And I think until we can do that, it's going to continue to be really difficult. So I look forward to giving people something to smile about, allowing them to reconnect, to be reborn again, and re-find our relationships in our community.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Chief Scott, how about you? What's the biggest challenge that you're facing?
Yeah, and just to add to what Chief Sylvester said, we know there's reforms, and we know there's mandates coming here in Texas as everywhere else, I imagine. Again, re-engaging our officers, re-engaging our community. There's much work to be done. And I like the quote that, it's not the things we do for the community. The officers are part of the community. So it's the things that we're doing together. Morale is going to continue to be an issue. I think we should focus internally as well, take care of our police officers, making sure their needs are being met as far as their well-being, making sure that we're watching those mental health issues, making sure that we're providing those opportunities to gain value out of the work that they do, to show that they're valued internally, so that we reward them for the great things that they do, and that we always tie that back to the community, which I think, all of our great law enforcement leaders are good at doing that. So we know the challenges are beset before us, but it's going to be a great opportunity. It's going to be a great time to be a law enforcement leader, because there's much work to be done, and a lot of good officers and good in our community to do that for. So
That's great. Thank you so much. Can I just say, this is the first panel we've had with leaders in local law enforcement. And I don't think that I could have asked for a better panel to actually kind of set the tone for what we're trying to do for the benefit of communities, just the ideas and perspectives. And I think just that community members need to hear from leaders like yourself about the challenges that you're facing in understanding what the needs are, managing those needs, being adaptive. I love the idea. Some of the things that really resonated with me today is the humanization aspect, which I think is so valuable to recognize that police officers are your residents, and they find value in helping others in whatever ways that they can to help create that quality of life in the community. And as an organization, you're building that community capital. You've got to do it ahead of time. You can't do it after the fact, because otherwise you don't get the benefit of community capital unless you already have it in the bank. That was just such a true statement. And then the use of social technology, social media, and those platforms that allow you to get to all aspects of your population. The Unitos idea, Chief Scott, I think is just a wonderful example of how you reach to those underrepresented groups of your community. And so all of the tools that you're using and all of the approaches and the building of those organizational and departmental cultures, and then paying attention to the needs of your employees just becomes the way that you do build that positive environment. And as a former city manager, your comments today would make every city manager in the world happy. So thank you for those perspectives. Let me just kind of make some final comments or final thoughts here. I will be following up with an email to all of you, and I'll give each of you your contact information so that you can connect each other if there's anything that you want to follow up with each other on. I will look forward to connecting with you again. These sessions are really designed to gather perspectives and then share them out with other local leaders in law enforcement, and honestly, just local governments and others who are working on community quality of life. But I would appreciate any feedback that any of you have on ways that we can make these panel conversations better. We are structuring these to be done on a weekly basis. Every Tuesday at 11, we're going to be recording these, and we'll be disseminating it out on our social media platforms. So we'll be having another session next week as well. So if you have any colleagues that you think would serve the profession well and be able to give some perspectives, I would welcome you to share their names with me and help me make those connections to make this continue on. But with that, I just want to thank you for being part of the panel, being the leaders that you are, and stepping up for doing the inaugural event of these panel conversations. And just really appreciate the ideas and thoughts and the way that you're handling your own individual departments. And best of luck with everything that you do going forward throughout everything that you're doing.